Good afternoon, everyone. This is Juana Hernandez, CFNC's representative for Spanish Services, and I would like to welcome you all to the fourth webinar of the CFNC Spanish Services webinar series, Policies and Opportunities for Students in Various Non-U.S. Statuses at the North Carolina Community Colleges. This webinar will be focusing on supporting students that are U.S. Citizens and non-U.S. citizens. We all know that Latina students that apply to North Carolina community colleges are in a wide variety of statuses. Depending on their individual status, they may or may not qualify for different benefits. So this session is going to provide an overview of the current North Carolina Community College admissions policies for non-U.S. citizens. We will also address common questions such as which non-U.S. citizens can and cannot be admitted to the college, what documentation is required for admission, what obstacles might hinder students of different statuses from attending college or obtaining a degree or certification, which statuses might qualify for in-state residency status, what financial benefits are available for different statuses, and lastly, in what ways can institutions best support these students in reaching their educational goals. Today with us is Heidi White. Heidi White has a wealth of knowledge in working with non-U.S. citizen students, and Heidi White is the Director of International Student Services and Study Abroad at Durham Tech Community College. Heidi holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's in international studies and has worked in many international and study abroad offices at various institutions in North Carolina and abroad. Heidi enjoys working with all non-U.S. citizen students in the admissions process, visa and immigration advising, and the evaluation of international credentials. She has spent much of her time at Durham Tech on outreach efforts to provide information on higher education opportunities for local immigrant communities. She also serves as the advisor for Durham Tech's Latinx club, Cambiando Caminos. Heidi believes that everyone should be able to achieve their educational goals no matter their immigration status. I want to thank Heidi for joining us and being here today. I want to say that personally, I have learned a lot from Heidi, and I just want to thank her for just being so patient and everything that she has shared with me. And I'm excited that she is going to be able to share her knowledge with all of you. So let me hand the microphone over to Heidi.
All right. Thank you all so much for attending this webinar today. Hopefully I can give you a wealth of information, and also would love to take some questions that hopefully we can answer, or we can refer you to other people or get back to you at a later time. So you heard a little bit about me, so hopefully that just gives you some background. I do want to just explain, so I'm going to try to give information in general for the policies, and then some information about how things work at the community college system. But my experience is at working at Durham Tech, so some of the examples I'm going to give are going to be for Durham Tech. And if you're looking at another one of the 58 community colleges in North Carolina, you may have to contact someone to see how a specific process works on that campus. I do work in the Center for the Global Learner at Durham Technical Community College. We're very lucky to have a centralized office for all of our international and global programs. Here, this list kind of shows you the different programs that we have all under the Center for the Global Learner umbrella, and we're very lucky. We've had this center for 10 years. We've celebrated our 10th anniversary. And I've highlighted here sort of the department that I'm mostly focusing on today, which is International Student Services. And under that, that's of course visas, any person who is educated outside the United States and or who is not a U.S. citizen, the admissions process for them. So what do we do in International Student Services? Again, I assist all non-U.S. citizens with their admissions process and explain there may be different steps that they have to take depending on their status. That includes permanent residents, students who are in the F1 visa status, which is this particular visa status in the United States for someone coming who's not a U.S. citizen to be a student, refugees, DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, undocumented students, and of course many other visa statuses. We'll give you some examples of those later, but basically if you think about like the alphabet soup of all the different types of visa statuses here in the United States. I also help with the residency exceptions and some of the sponsorship processing, and I'll be giving you more information on that if you're not quite sure what that is in a few minutes. I also review international education credentials for admissions. So specifically if someone, let's say they're coming here from Mexico, they were educated in Mexico, I would look at their documents from Mexico to see if that meets the criteria of a U.S. high school equivalent degree or a bachelor's degree, master's degree, etc. Again, also work a lot with the students on that student F1 visa for benefits and compliance. And sort of like today, do outreach to school and community members about educational opportunities in higher education in general, and then specifically at the school I work with at Durham Tech. And I advise and support related student clubs, so international students or specifically Latino students, etc. So a few things we kind of wanted to ask the audience, and if you can respond back in the chat box just so we get some idea of your response to these questions. So what I first wanted to know is if you're someone who works with a lot of non-U.S. citizen students who are trying to get higher education, what do you think they struggle the most with for access and resources? And if you have a very specific question, you can go ahead and write that in, and we'll try to see if we're going to address that or try to address it at a later time. All right. So first, I want to just show you and talk a little bit about the North Carolina Community College admissions policy. So this is the policy. It's quite lengthy, so it takes more than one slide. But basically, this just describes what that policy is. I've highlighted a couple things that I think are really important just to make sure you understand what that policy is. So it is considered an open door policy, but there are some ways that there are designated for certain groups of people. So when specifically talking about an undocumented immigrant, which they define here in B as meaning an immigrant who is not lawfully present in the United States, it's saying that the North Carolina Community College can admit undocumented immigrants as long as they're under certain conditions. So the first one is they have to have attended and graduated from a United States public high school, private high school, or homeschool that operates in compliance with state or local law. So that is one thing that we often are having to tell students, that if they have graduated with a U.S. GED, unfortunately that does not meet this policy. It does have to be an actual high school degree. That would include adult high school, but again would not include currently a GED or HiSET or any of the new equivalencies that many schools are accepting. It also says when you're determining who an undocumented immigrant is, you have to use federal classifications. And it goes on to say they cannot be considered a resident for tuition purposes, of course, which means they're going to be paying out-of-state tuition. And there's also a mention here about community colleges needing to take into account that the federal law prohibits states from granting professional licenses to undocumented immigrants. Now, I would say that really does sort of depend on the professional license and the requirements for the license, but just to mention that that is mentioned here in that admissions policy. And that students lawfully present in the United States are supposed to have priority over any undocumented immigrant in any class or program of study where capacity limitations exist. So that is part of the community college admissions policy. Now, I want to move on and talk. So that was some admissions policies that are very specific and mentioned very specifically about undocumented immigrants. However, the DACA program, came out in 2012 as an executive order from President Obama. And then there were specific memos that were written through the North Carolina Community College System Attorney that indicated how DACA students were to be treated as far as the community college admissions policy. So there was a memo written in August of 2013 that said a student who'd been approved for DACA did not meet the definition of an undocumented immigrant because they had received that DACA, they were considered lawfully present while on that deferment. And so, that came out. So again, the part that we just read about undocumented immigrants, they really separated out the students that were approved for DACA and said, the items that were listed there for undocumented immigrants does not apply to DACA students. But it did also indicate that individual community colleges, so there's 58 in the North Carolina system, would have the discretion to determine whether they wanted to admit a DACA student if leading to professional licensure. And also that they did not have the capacity for in-state tuition. So that was sort of the first memo that came out. And if you're working in a community college and you haven't seen this memo, I think they're all accessible through online. If you want to see the exact language that came out from the attorney. If not, hopefully someone in your admissions office would be able to pull that memo. And I do have copies of all of them if someone is having difficulty finding them. The second memo that came out a little more than a month after that was in September of 2013, and it indicated that a person who's been approved for DACA could utilize the business sponsorship exception, but that they could not utilize the public school graduate or the nonprofit sponsorship. Now, those three types of sponsorship you may or may not be familiar with, and we're going to go into detail about those in a few minutes. But I just wanted to list that in the memo, it did specify they can use the first one listed here, business sponsorship, but that they could not utilize the public school or nonprofit one. The third memo was a kind of a follow-up to that September 13th memo, 2013 memo. It came out in January of 2014, and they had basically wanted to contact the Attorney General's office to get a follow-up onto whether DACA recipients could utilize the public school graduate or nonprofit sponsorship, and it was determined through the North Carolina Attorney General's office that no, they still could not. I also just wanted to bring your attention to another memo about a different type of non-U.S. citizen, which are people that have temporary protected status. There also was a memo that came out in 2012, in December of 2012, that said that if you had been approved for temporary protected status, you may be able to establish the capacity to qualify for in-state tuition. This should be covered through the Residency Determination Service, and I know the last webinar was on information about RDS. If you're working with a student that has TPS and they're not receiving that through the regular RDS system, I would definitely contact someone at RDS. But there was a specific memo in December of 2012 that also talked about it. Since we're talking about access and about admissions policies, I know we're specifically talking about North Carolina, but I did just want to bring everybody's attention to the fact that these policies that we're talking about are specific to North Carolina and specific to community colleges, what I'm covering today. But as you can see, the map of the United States is a wide variety of colors, and that is because there are different policies in different states, and you can see with the different colors here kind of the different, I guess, levels of access or levels of funding that's available to different types of students. So that's just to let you know that if you're working with students that are having difficulties with funding and or access, they may want to look to other states to see what policies there might be there. All right, so one of the biggest issues that many of you put in the poll, and also when I've talked to many other groups, have always indicated the biggest issue is usually with financing higher education. And we could probably say that about all students, but I think particularly students that may not be able to qualify for all the different types of aid. So of course, my suggestions for any student trying to finance their higher education would be first to apply for federal financial aid, which can include grants, work-study, loans, etc. But they can only do that, of course, if they qualify, or can only receive the money if they qualify. The second thing I would, of course, encourage would be institutional scholarships. Some particular colleges have that, including some of the North Carolina community colleges. There might be different funding sources for how those are given. Some of those might be for new students coming right out of high school. Some of those might be, for students after they've performed well for one semester, et cetera. But I would definitely encourage all students, of course, to look at any institutional scholarships for where they are applying. And then, of course, there's a wealth of outside scholarships, some of which are very competitive. And I know in I think the first and maybe the second webinar, there were a lot of links about those. Since I work at Durham Tech, we also have a lot of lists of those scholarships on our financial aid website, and even have the ones specific to students that may not have status in the United States that they may be able to qualify for. So I would highly encourage students, of course, to look at those as well. Another thing I want to draw your attention to, if you are not aware, is the North Carolina Promise Program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the last thing, one thing I know we're going to focus on in this webinar is the tuition exceptions at the North Carolina Community College, some of which I've mentioned already, but I'll go into more detail in a second. So the first thing, my first suggestion for funding higher education, of course, is financial aid. There are some non-U.S. citizen statuses that can qualify for federal financial aid, so I would definitely contact a financial aid counselor at the institution that you're applying to look for that. This is directly copied and pasted from the student aid website, and it outlines which non-U.S. citizens can qualify. So that's usually the U.S. permanent residents, refugees, asylum granted, which means not are you pending asylum and you're waiting for that answer, but you've actually received that asylum, Cuban Haitian entrants, conditional entrants, parolees, etc. So if you are working with a student that might meet any of this criteria, definitely encourage them. Also have them reach out to the financial aid office for the school in which they are applying. In addition, there's also financial aid available if you hold a T non-immigrant status, so that's for victims of human trafficking, for battered qualified immigrant qualified aliens with the VAWA Act. Also, if you're citizens of particular small countries, they may also qualify. So again, I would have, if you're working with someone, have them check this list, have them work with a financial aid officer to see if they may qualify. So speaking of tuition and fees, I'm sure many of you are aware, especially since many of you put in your survey that you were students are most concerned with the tuition. So I did just want to do some examples. This is a chart of information that we use when we're talking to students, again, mostly focused on the central part of North Carolina in the Durham area, but I'm sure some of you could make charts like this about the schools that your students usually attend or the schools in your area. As you may or may not know, the North Carolina Community College system tuition is set for every college. The only thing that really differs from college to college is the fees. So fees can be set by an individual college. So these tuition and fee examples here are from Durham Tech, but it should be hopefully very similar to other community colleges, but you could look at the fees to see how much they differ. Community colleges do charge per credit, so that's why there's a range. So that is, I think, between 12 and 16 credits, the lower number being the 12 and the higher number being the 16. And then you can see the difference between the in-state and the out-of-state. I've also listed here some local universities so you can see the difference in the in-state and out-of-state tuition as compared to the North Carolina community colleges. And then, of course, for private institutions, there would just be one rate because they don't do in and out-of-state tuition. So you can kind of see what the differences are even among some of the North Carolina colleges and in the North Carolina university system. You can see that some of their in-state and out-of-state fees actually vary somewhat significantly. Now, I also mentioned the North Carolina Promise Program, and I just want to again mention that because I think the word hasn't completely gotten out on that, and so I wanted to just make sure everybody is aware of that. That starting fall of 2018, North Carolina does have 3 universities with dramatically decreased tuition charges from the past. Their in-state tuition for in-state residents is set at $500 per semester, and the out-of-state is set at $2,500 per semester, and those 3 colleges are listed here: Elizabeth City State, University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and Western Carolina. And so if you're considered a North Carolina resident, you can see that $500 tuition per semester, and that tuition cost will stay the same for 4 consecutive years. Those tuition costs also would apply to transfer students, so you don't have to be going in as a first-year student to those schools. So that is something I often talk to students about, especially students who are having to pay the out-of-state tuition, even students who are struggling with in-state tuition and may or may not qualify for financial aid. Those 3 universities do have a set tuition rate, and so that's something for them to consider. And as you can see here, that tuition rate actually ends up being even less than the North Carolina Community College. Now, there are many other fees that need to be considered, and they may require students to live on campus, and there may be, so room and board fees are not considered in that, but just that should be hopefully something that students are looking for when they're trying to find affordable college. Okay, so let's get to talking a little bit about the tuition exceptions at the North Carolina Community College. And I've mentioned these a couple already, and I know some of you aren't as familiar, so I want to go through them one by one. So this is the list of tuition exceptions specific at the North Carolina Community College. The first one is called business-sponsored tuition, although I often refer to it as employer sponsorship because an employer could be a nonprofit or something else, so it's not always necessarily particular to what many people consider a business. There's also nonprofit sponsored tuition, the North Carolina Public School Graduate tuition exception, refugee, non-resident of the U.S., which really kind of means pending permanent resident. There's a tuition exception for business and military transferred families and one for federal law enforcement officers. Now, all of these tuition exceptions are outside of the RDS system. So a person who may qualify for one of these would not get that information through RDS. So they really are having to know this information or going to the right place at the North Carolina Community College to either request this exception or ask what documents need to be turned in, or for someone to recommend that this might be an exception that they may qualify for. So that does make it a little bit more difficult in that they have to know the right office to go to or the right person to ask or the right place on the website to find the information. But these are exceptions that are supposed to be available at any North Carolina community college. And we're going to go through them one by one. The 2 links at the bottom are resources or references where you can read more about these specific tuition exceptions. Okay, so the first one is called the business-sponsored tuition exception. And this is copied sort of directly from the manual that talks about it. And basically it's saying if a student is employed by a North Carolina business and the North Carolina employer wants to pay the tuition for the student, then the employer will be charged the in-state tuition rate no matter what the tuition rate is of the student. So this is something that it can apply to anyone. It's really not specific for a U.S. citizen, non-U.S. citizen. It's really anyone that is working for a North Carolina employer, but the employer would never have to pay the out-of-state tuition even if the student's residency status is out of state because they're going through this business sponsorship process. Now, every college of the 58 community colleges would have to develop their own requirements or paperwork to process this. And again, remember, this is for anyone. It can be for an American, U.S. citizen, who's working and their company wants to pay their tuition, or it can be for a non-U.S. citizen. It again is not specific to any of that. So each institution would have to develop their own requirements and timeline for the student to be able to take advantage of that. As an example, you can see the process at Durham Tech. We have the employer writing a letter that is signed that saying that they want to sponsor the student for a particular semester. We only accept a letter for each term at a time, and they have to write a new letter to continue that sponsorship. The student also needs to provide a recent pay stub showing that they are working for that organization or business. And then if it's a first-time employer, our school also requires a vendor form and a W-9 form. Then once all that documentation is acceptable, then the student's tuition and fees are transferred to that vendor, so that employer, and then the employer would get billed after our 10% or census date. Now again, other community colleges I know do it in a different way. They may also require a letter. Some schools may require multiple pay stubs. Some schools don't require a pay stub. So it really just depends on the community college. Some community colleges have the business pay up front at the time when tuition and fees would be due by the student. Others, again, like Durham Tech, may wait till a later date. But this is, a policy that hopefully some students would be able to take advantage of if they have an employer that does want to support them in their education. Okay, and remember from earlier in the PowerPoint, DACA recipients are able to take advantage of this business-sponsored tuition. So that you have a lot of DACA students or DACA applicants to your college, that could be an option for their employer to only pay the in-state tuition for them to attend your college. The next tuition exception I want to talk a little bit about is called nonprofit sponsored tuition. So this one is a little bit different because it is written specifically about the student, and it is saying the student that's going to be sponsored has to be lawfully admitted to the United States. And you can read all the rest of this. It does say that the entity sponsoring them does have to be a North Carolina nonprofit, and they have to be approved under Section 501c3 of the IRS, or they can also be a civic league under 501c4. And basically they would have to provide an affidavit to the community college saying that they will pay for that student, and they can one individual nonprofit or civic league can only sponsor 5 residents per year. So again, you can see there's a couple other provisions here under this nonprofit sponsored tuition. So again, each community college would need to develop their process for paperwork and timing and payment for a student to take advantage of this. And I'll give you an example of how we do it at Durham Tech. But remember from previously in the presentation, a DACA DACA approved student would not be eligible for this per the North Carolina memos. So the student has to be in valid non-U.S. citizen status. So someone at the community college would have to validate that. So the way that works is it comes through my office, and we look at the immigration documents to make sure they're in a status that would qualify. We require a letter written by the nonprofit or the civic league saying they want to sponsor the student for a particular semester. Again, we only do it one term at a time. We also require them to provide proof that they are a North Carolina nonprofit or a North Carolina civic league. And then again, we have them fill out the vendor application and W-9 form. And again, at Durham Tech, we wait and charge the vendor after the 10% date, but allow the student to enroll in the classes prior to that date. Again, other community colleges may have them pay up front, may have them do other types of forms, etc. But this is something that certain students may be able to take advantage of for a tuition exception. I will say the most common students in my experience, that have taken advantage of this are usually students that are in one of the alphabet visas. So especially might be students in the F1 visa status. If you have students that are spouses or dependents of F1 students at other colleges or universities, or J1 visa applicants, or J2 spouses or dependents, those are the ones that I have seen the most at my college and my experience with this. Okay. The next exception I wanted to talk about is the North Carolina Public High School graduate exception. So again, this is for any person who's been lawfully admitted to the United States and who was basically assigned to a public school and graduated from that public school. And it's basically saying that would give them the in-state tuition rate, but it doesn't necessarily make them a resident of North Carolina for any other purposes. Again, we saw in the beginning of this presentation that there was a memo from the system office that said this cannot be applied to students who are undocumented or DACA. And again, each institution would need to develop the process for these exceptions. So at what office would they need to go to show their paperwork that shows they're lawfully admitted to the United States and proof that they graduated from a public high school in North Carolina. So each institution, again, would have to develop that exception process. Sorry, the question was, what is lawfully admitted? So lawfully admitted, again, I'm not an attorney, but lawfully admitted would mean they would have entered the United States and gone through inspection where they received permission to enter the United States for in a certain visa status up to a certain period of time. That would also, permanent residents would also qualify because they're given a green card that gives them a certain period of time to be in the United States, or a visa if it's their first entrance. So those would be considered lawfully admitted. You can also change your status in the United States, and you would have an official approval from United States Citizenship and Immigration Service that indicates that you have a new status and what the period of lawful stay would be for that. So that would be what I would be considering lawfully admitted. If you have an attorney to consult, to get proof, for your particular college, you might want that. But generally, I think that's what lawfully admitted would mean. And again, remember, we have the memos from North Carolina Community College systems that have determined that that does not apply to undocumented or DACA students at this time. Okay. The next tuition exception I want to talk about is the refugee tuition exception. So this says a refugee that lawfully entered the United States and is living in the state can receive tuition at the in-state rate, even if they haven't been in North Carolina for the 12-month qualifying period. So this is really important because sometimes refugees have just entered the United States a few months ago and they want to enroll in college very quickly. And I think through the current RDS process, they would probably require them to have the 12-month qualifying period in refugee status in North Carolina before they would qualify. So this really is a benefit to refugee students that are trying to enroll before they can prove the 12-month qualifying period or before they have been here for 12 months. Again, this is very specific to community college. An applicant would have to present those official refugee documents. Again, at each community college, that might be at a different office or to a different person. And like I said, each institution would need to develop the process for how they're handling these exceptions. And this would not be specifically for an asylee or for someone who's pending asylum, because the way this law or policy is specifically written is it uses the word refugee. And so refugees and asylees are in many cases considered in separate categories. Just for clarification, as many of you may already know, a refugee is someone who is approved outside the United States, and so when they enter officially in refugee status, and they had gone through a long process, to be approved as a refugee and being able to enter the United States as a refugee. An asylee is someone who's in the United States that then applies for asylee and goes through the process in the United States to be able to stay. So those are different types of statuses. So I have often found in working especially with the new RDS system that there are many refugees that don't qualify. Again, even if they've been here for 12 months, they just might not have the right paperwork. So this is something, if you're working with someone who's a refugee and for whatever reason RDS is not giving them the in-state resident tuition status, this is an exception that's on the books for North Carolina Community College system that is specific to a refugee. The refugee would just need to present documents that show they are officially a refugee. It's usually what we call an I-94 card that they were given when they entered the country that says they're a refugee. And actually there's usually no expiration on that document. There's also sometimes another document that has pictures of the refugee and or their family members that came in with them that shows that they are an official refugee to the United States. Okay. So the ones I have already spoken about, those are the most common exceptions, I would say, in my day-to-day work with North Carolina Community College students. The other ones I'm going to mention because they are exceptions, and some of you out there actually may have more experience with these than I do. I just don't see these as often, but I did want to make sure I mention them because they are, quote, on the books. So there's also an exception for a non-resident of the United States, and I put in parentheses and quotation marks pending permanent resident, because basically this is saying someone who is a non-resident in the United States, but they have lived in North Carolina for 12 months, and they have filed the petitions basically to become a permanent resident, so that's why I call it a pending permanent resident, because they're waiting for that answer. And so basically, I think this exception was basically made in case that petition is taking a really long time for them not to have to continue waiting. But it's been very rare that I've ever had this student. I think especially now with RDS, hopefully RDS is meeting the criteria of the residency manual and giving them the in-state tuition. But if you ever do have someone who has filed their I-130, I-360, or I-140, those are all immigration forms for different reasons of becoming a permanent resident, and they've also been in North Carolina for 12 months. This could be an exception if they're not gaining that in-state resident through RDS. And again, each institution would need to develop the process for, again, who would this person bring their documents to, and who would enter that information into the student information system so they receive that in-state tuition bill. The other two tuition exceptions, like I said, I have even less experience with. There is one for business and military transferred families that you may be working with a student that may meet this criteria. So community colleges are given the leeway for up to 1% of the out-of-state residents. They can change up to 1% of enrolled students into the in-state tuition to accommodate families that are transferred to North Carolina by business, industry, or civilian families transferred into North Carolina by the military. So that's just something that community colleges are given. So if you're meeting with a student that you think might meet that exception, again, figuring out what office to talk to at the community college to see if they can be allowed to be part of that 1%. And then the last one is federal law enforcement officers, firefighters, and EMS personnel, rescue, life, etc. If their permanent station is in North Carolina, then they should be eligible through this exception to receive this in-state community college tuition rate to support their organization's training needs. Again, I have not specifically worked with a student that meets this criteria, but some of you all across North Carolina may know a student that may meet this exception so that they can receive the in-state tuition bill for their enrollment. I do have this chart that I made for my use that I'm sharing with you, although there are some specific things written on here, like about contacting the office on my campus called the CGL, the Center for the Global Learner. But hopefully this chart might be helpful. So again, it goes through some different immigration statuses for non-U.S. citizens, whether they're eligible for federal financial aid, whether they're eligible for in-state tuition, and then additional notes. So for example, at the top we talked about refugees. Refugees are eligible to apply for federal financial aid. They can be eligible for in-state tuition, and again, they may have to be in North Carolina for 12 months, but even if they're not, remember, they have that refugee exception that the college can put in so they can immediately receive the in-state tuition even if they don't get it through RDS. So this goes through the many different statuses. Now what gets complicated, as you can see in the middle, is the other visa statuses, because it really depends on the particular visa as to whether they would meet certain exceptions or not. But hopefully this at least does get you started as a reference tool. And so I'm happy to share that. And if anybody finds any new information to update on this chart or has any questions, please let me know. Things with immigration are always evolving. So there's always new things that can come out in memos or in laws that we would need to update. So that is the main part of the presentation of information that I had, but I definitely want to pause to answer questions we have received and or to give you time to ask lots of questions. I had a question about what is public school sponsorship. Hopefully we went through that when I talked about the public high school exception specifically. Yeah, getting back to the poll, I think most of you echoed sort of what we thought you would echo in most of the main concerns for especially undocumented and DACA students is the financial support and having to pay the out-of-state tuition. So hopefully I provided you at least some information about some possibilities that might help some of those students, although not every exception helps those students. Somebody else asked a question. I'll try to go back to the colored chart. So I don't know if you can see all of the legend. The pink at the bottom says states where some college systems deny enrollment. And currently I think Georgia is the only state that is in that color. But I think there's been some laws in Georgia where they're not allowing undocumented students to attend. That said, I'm not an expert on all of the details of all those colors. I would highly suggest you do some research or contact colleges within those states if you have more questions. I really just wanted to illustrate that in different states across the United States there are different policies, and so what we have in North Carolina is what we have, but that there are different laws in each state. So if you're working with students, if they're open to applying to different states, not that I'm encouraging them to leave North Carolina, I'm been a lifetime North Carolinian, and I think we're a great state, and I want great students to go to our great institutions of higher education, but just to give them the opportunity to see that there are different resources available in different states, and there's really a continuum of that. Some states even give state financial aid. No, you can't give federal financial aid to students in certain categories that don't meet the qualifications we talked about, but some states can give state financial aid. So we have a question that said some institutions consider undocumented students as international students. Does this mean undocumented students can apply for scholarships designated for international students? I would say my first inclination to that would be yes, but you would probably have to contact the individual funder or if it's the institution that's giving out the scholarship to see what is the criteria for the international student scholarship. You know, that's a difficult question to answer, but I would definitely explore that as a possibility. Any other questions that anybody has? And we will be sending out this PowerPoint, so hopefully you'll have access to all this information. One thing I did, it's on the slide, but I just want to mention it one more time, is I keep referring to these tuition exceptions would have to be handled by someone at the particular community college, and that can vary which office that would be. I might start with the admissions office to ask who that is, but basically once a student is determined that they can meet one of these exceptions, that information would then have to be put into the student information system, into a particular screen, so that the charge for that student or the charge to the employer or nonprofit would be at that in-state rate. So there's like several steps that a college might have to take to make sure the student is getting that exception and being billed correctly. And I just can't answer for the 58 colleges exactly what office that would be, and it's probably going to vary from college to college depending on how they've set up their processes. Hopefully I'm not making you dizzy. Oh, and there's one more question coming in. Which codes do you use in which screens? I assume that's going back to the thing I just talked about. So if you work at a community college, this might make sense, and if you don't, this might sound like another language. But basically, sorry, hopefully I'm not making you all dizzy. Where was it? But basically, the codes need to be put into Colleague, which is the student information system for the North Carolina Community College system, and the screen is RGPE, and each one of these tuition exceptions, hopefully your college has set up the student type for these so that when the student is approved for whichever exception, that exception can be entered in. And then when the bill is created for the student, it would reflect that in-state tuition. Now, it might be slightly different for the business and nonprofit because that bill actually goes to a third party, right, not to the student. But for the others, it should be for the student's bill. So the question I have is, would it be best to contact colleges individually for any questions and concerns that we may have about a student? If it is in regards to like what are the financial resources for a particular student or particular student type, yes, again, like so there's not a standard process for each college. So I would definitely reach out to the college that the student is interested in applying to ask them about what is the process for some of these exceptions, or I have a student, this is information about the student, or have the student contact the college as well. We definitely want to empower the student, but maybe you're there to support them, to ask these questions or to ask what are the resources for an undocumented student, what are the resources for a DACA student, what are the resources for an international student or a student with TPS, etc. So I would encourage that for sure, and you could do that anonymously and just talk in general about a student. You could do it with specific information if you're there with the student, or have the student do it if they're willing to share that information. All right. Another question came in that says, if a student came to the U.S. with a temporary visa but overstayed it, are they still considered lawfully admitted? That is a wonderful question, and I think I would have to refer you to an attorney if you want them to get the most specific and best answer, because every situation is a little bit different. I think once you have overstayed your visa, I mean, technically you don't necessarily have a status. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for more detailed information or any specific things about a particular visa type, and it's so individual, I would definitely refer the student to an attorney. But I think from the college's perspective, if a student came in and they had a visa and it had expired, I would then consider them an undocumented student because the documents they have are no longer valid. All right. Again, thank you all for participating. And we do just want to remind you about the future webinars coming up.
Thank you so much, Heidi. This is Juana Hernandez again, everyone. um, Thank you again for all of the great knowledge that you shared with us, all of the great information. I do want to remind everyone that we have two remaining webinars that are coming up on November 26th. We'll be talking more about North Carolina Community College's career training and higher ed options for all students. And then our last one will be on December 11th, Si se puede, building trust and relationships, and we will have someone from Surrey Community College that's going to be joining us. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and we will be sharing the webinars with you all soon, and we will be sending the PowerPoint in addition to a survey. So we do ask that you please respond to the survey. And then wanted to let you all know that we have a couple of our recordings now available on cfnc.org, and we have them, you can access them 4 different ways, and you'll see them here. You can go to cfnc.org under the resources, videos under the pay tab. There's a section that says en español, and you'll find them there. We've also included the link here. There's also a rotating banner on cfnc.org. And then you can also access them through the link that was sent to you via email. I think April sent an email with all the information, but you can also access them on the YouTube channel. But just wanted to let you all know that the first webinar and the second webinar that we did have been posted and are available, and the other webinars will be posted soon. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope that you will join the next one. And again, thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Everybody, hope everyone has a wonderful evening.